Hey guys, my name's Dave from DT Unboxed, and in this video, I'm gonna be doing a step-by-step PC build. And I'm gonna try to make this as simple as possible to follow along with. So first off, let's talk about the parts that I've used. Now I've done a bit of research myself. I've made sure all the parts that I've bought are compatible. So I'll leave a link in the description below to some websites that can help you with that. Now the purpose of this PC build is editing workstation for myself and my YouTube channels. My iMac's not really cutting it with the 4K videos anymore, so I've decided to build something a bit beefier. Now this is not going to be the cheapest build that you can get. These parts, a lot of them are quite expensive, but the process of building the PC itself is more or less the same. And I'll run through all those steps with you. So first off, with the CPU, I'm using an AMD Ryzen 3950X. So this is a beast of a CPU, 16 cores on that. Next, for the motherboard, I'm gonna be using the Asus TUF Gaming X570 Plus with Wi-Fi inbuilt, so I don't need a Wi-Fi card. Now this isn't the best motherboard going around, but for its price, it's got some really good features there and supports the 3950X. Now there's actually a spreadsheet that I'll leave in linked in the description below. So if you're gonna be using some of those high-end AMD processors, you can check and see what motherboards are compatible and recommended. Next, for the RAM, I've got 4 16 gig sticks of the Ripjaws G-Skill RAM. So this is 3200 CL16 RAM. I could have gone for the 3600, but it was tricky to find. Everything was kind of sold out near me. So I decided to just go with 3200. Did a little bit of research and people said that 3600 is what you should go for with these higher end AMDs, but 3200 is fine as well. And that, I wouldn't really notice much of a difference. Again, I'm just gonna be using this for video editing. I'm not gonna be tweaking all the features to really push this to its max. I was just interested in buying something that was of decent quality that would last me a while. So I don't think I'll be losing sleep over 3200 to 3600. Now for storage, I have the Samsung 970 EVO Plus M.2 SSD. So that's a 2 terabyte one. So that's not very cheap. It's pretty pricey, but I figured I'd just buy one. Don't need any physical hard drives or anything like that. Next, for graphics card, I have the Asus TUF Gaming 1650 Super. Now, a lot of you are probably going to be laughing and thinking, why the hell is he using such an underpowered graphics card with that 3950X? And the reason is I'm going to be waiting for the 3000 series that's coming out later in the year. So this is just a placeholder for now. This is just to get me by. But when that next gen of graphics cards come out, I'm going to be picking up one of them. I could have gone with the 2080 Ti, and that's what I was going to originally do, but I figured probably should just wait and see what the next gen looks like. In terms of CPU cooling, I got the Corsair H115i RGB Pro XT. Now this isn't full RGB. The only RGB element is the cooler that's going to be attached to the chip. The fans aren't RGB. Personally, I think RGB is a little bit tacky, so I've opted to save money and go with the cheaper one, but it does the exact same thing. For power supply, I got the Corsair RM750 80 Plus Gold model. So this is a really solid power supply from the research I've done. Didn't go with the 850 because I'm only going to be running one graphics card. So 750 should be fine. And with that aside, finally we have the case. So again, I've opted to go with some Corsair here. So this is the 110Q mid-tower case. So I didn't want something that was too bulky. I know that, if I had something bigger, it's probably gonna be better for airflow and cooling, but I wanted something compact and I wanted something quiet as well. So this particular model Q is for quiet, I believe. It's got some dampening around the sides, so it's not going to be super noisy. But this does come in a model, I think it's called the 110R, I believe. And that's got clear sides, so you can show off your RGB if that's your sort of thing. But for this particular model, there's no see-through panels, so it's a very clean sort of setup. So those are all the parts I'm going to be using in this build. But be aware that you should do your research and check compatibility if you're swapping certain elements in or out. The last thing you want is to have something fully built and then realize that, you know, it doesn't work and then have to take everything out. So be sure to check compatibility. Okay, so first things first, let's pull out our motherboard, and you're going to want to just make sure you don't touch any of the soldered parts or the metallic parts. Just grab everything by the edge, and we'll use our box as our workstation. Okay, so it goes without saying, but you don't want any static electricity whilst you're working on your CPU. So make sure you just ground yourself, or every now and then just touch a metallic part like your CPU case just to get rid of any of the static. Or you can use one of those static bands that grounds you. Now, before you get started on the motherboard, it's always a good idea to read the instruction manual just so you can see what all the connection points are and where everything goes. Now, let's start by installing our CPU first. So just make sure you grab the CPU by the corners. You don't want to touch the top or the back. So be really careful there. Now on the CPU, in one corner, there'll be a tiny little arrow, and you'll need to align that with the tiny little arrow that's on the motherboard. So we'll just drop that in. You got the right fit, and then we can pull this lever back down. So first part is done and our CPU is installed. All right, next let's install our RAM. Now this is pretty straightforward. Now this motherboard's got 4 DIMM slots. If you're using 2 DIMMs, then you need to check with the motherboard on which 2 you should use. In my case, I'm using 4 DIMMs, so I'll just use all of them. But if you have 2, you might just need to use these 2 or these 2. Just check with your motherboard to see which one. And there's only one way that it can go in. So there's a little groove here and it'll line up with the groove on the DIMM slot. If you have it the other way, it just won't work. Pop it in and then just push down until the lever clicks in. And then we just repeat that process with the rest of our RAM. Right, so now we've got all our RAM installed. Next, let's move on to our M.2 SSD. Now in your motherboard box, there will be M.2 standoff screws. So just make sure you do not lose them because they're really important. Now for this particular motherboard, there's 2 locations where you can install your M.2 SSD, here or here. Now this location has a heatsink on it. I did a little bit of research and it seems that it really doesn't make much of a difference whether you use this one or this one in terms of speed. People seem to think that using the one close to the CPU is better, so I'll go with this particular slot here. So first off, with your standoff screw, we just need to figure out which one we'll be using. So you can just put your SSD there just to measure it up, as M.2 sticks come in different lengths. So we want this one here. So I'll just take my standoff screw and put it into place. Okay, so I got my standoff screw in. So with the SSD, you'll just stick it into the slot here. And what should happen is it should look like a bit of a springboard. It will stick up a tiny bit. You push it down, and with the tiny screw that is included, we just need to screw that down. Now you don't want to screw it up too tight, just enough so that it no longer flicks up like a diving board. So there's our SSD, and that is now good to go. Now remember, you do not want to lose those standoff screws, so just make sure you put them somewhere safe, just in case you want to install another SSD. Now usually at this point you could install the CPU fan if the CPU you bought came with a fan, but in our case I'm going to be using a liquid cooler, so I'm going to actually install that later once this is in our case. But for now, this is all we need, so now I'll pop it into our CORSAIR case. All right, so now we've got our case here. All right, so first let's install our I/O shield for the motherboard. So usually all the audio ports will be down the bottom. So we'll just pop that in. You just gotta push it till it clicks. All right, so I/O shield is in, good to go. Now just make sure you have the right amount of standoffs in the case to support your motherboard. Sometimes these cases don't have the right amount of standoff, so you just need to make sure they're in the right spot, and then we'll place our motherboard in. So again, just be careful here not to touch any of the components. So once you've got your motherboard in place and the holes are aligned, now you can just start screwing. Now a good idea when screwing in the motherboard is to go in a crisscross pattern. So go on each corner in a diagonal sort of motion, just so you got an even amount of pressure. So I'm just going to quickly remove the hard drive cage here. So I have some more room to play with inside the case. I'm not going to be using any physical hard drives. I already got the M.2, so that's more than enough. All right, so next I'm going to install the connectors for the HD audio and USB and power switches on top of the case. So first of all, let's do our USB, which we'll find here in front of our RAM. Next, we have our front panel audio. So this will say HD audio, and we'll plug it onto the motherboard here where it says AAFP. So audio front panel. Just make sure the pins align. So there'll be one pin that will be blocked out, and that should align perfectly with the motherboard. Okay, so HD audio is done. Next, we need to install our power switch and our reset switch and our LED indicators. So they're going to all be up here at the front. Now it's really small to see, and so you'll just need to just get up close, read the instruction manual, and you'll be able to see where each one will go. So for our particular case, we had a power LED, positive, negative. We have a power switch and reset switch. So I've just plugged them into their appropriate pins. And again, you'll just need to refer to your motherboard to know which one's which. And finally, I'm just going to quickly connect this fan here at the back of the case. And there's multiple locations that will work, so just go with whatever suits you best. But of course, refer to the motherboard as well, because some fan power locations will be a little bit different. All right, so we've got this CPU fan cable, but I'm actually going to route it around the back so it's a bit neater. All right, next, let's install our CPU liquid cooler. Now, it'll come pre-installed with an Intel bracket, but since I'm installing it on an AMD 3950X, I've put on the AM4 bracket here. So if you're installing Intel, the cooler will come with this motherboard bracket. So you'll need to install that on the back of your motherboard for an Intel install. But for this, we just need the AMD bracket. So it's pretty easy to put that on. You just slide them off by pulling them sideways. So just be careful not to touch the thermal paste here on the cooler when you're doing that. So next, what we're going to do is we're going to install the fans onto the radiator. Now, CORSAIR recommend mounting the fans as an air intake into the CPU for best performance. So as a general guide, the main logo will be the side or the direction which air gets blown to. So the logo's on this side, the air will be going that way. And so we'll be mounting our fans on top of the radiator like this with the CPU cooler on the inside. So you'll need to grab these long screws and then you can secure the fans to the radiator. All right, now that we got our fans on, let's now put it into our case. So we're going to mount this radiator to the front of our case like this. So let's just put this over the top here so it doesn't interfere with our motherboard. And from here, you'll need to grab the small screw and the washer and secure the radiator to the case from this front side. So now we've got our radiator attached to the front of the case. Okay, next, since we're using the AMD mounts, we'll need to take these clips and these thumb screws and install them onto the side like so. So you can just turn them with your thumb until they're loose enough. We'll do the same on the other side. All right, so let's just take off this cover now and we're going to pop it onto the CPU. But also what we want to do, there's these hooks here on the motherboard mount and we need to hook them onto these. So just carefully place it down. I'm just going to loosen these up a little bit actually. That seems to be in place and they're both hooked in. So I'll now just tighten the screws with my thumb. Okay, that's nice and tight. Whilst I'm at it, I might take off this plastic strip from the top. Okay, so the cooler block will have these two cables coming from it, and you'll need to attach the two fans to these two cables. So I'll do that now. Actually, I'm gonna route this at the back so it's a bit neater. All right, so I'll clean that up later on. And now I'll just get back to the front. Okay, so from the cooling block, there'll also be a SATA power cable. So we'll need to plug that in once we've got our PSU in. And there's also a CPU fan connection here. So we'll plug that into the CPU fan socket here. And this one will route out the back for our SATA later on. Okay, so that's the power sorted for the pump and the cooling block and the radiator and the fan. And the final thing is just the USB cable for the RGB. So we'll need to connect that to any USB port that you have here on the motherboard. Pop that back here. The USB will go on the side of the cooling block. And then our USB power cable will just come out here. And again, just refer to your motherboard for the location of them, but they should be down here somewhere. So those are all the steps you need to take to install your H115i liquid cooler. Okay, next we're going to install our PSU. So let's just get that out. So let's make sure we get all the right cables first and plug them in here before we install it into the case. Okay, so let's see what cables we're going to need for our particular setup. We're going to need 2 CPU cables. So we need a full 8-pin and then a 4-pin. So now these can actually separate. So you can pull them apart and use 4-pin as well. So we got our 2 CPUs. We got 1 PCIe for our graphics card. We need a SATA cable for our liquid cooler, and then we've got our motherboard power cable, and that should just about do it for our particular setup. So I'll put these other cables away, and it's a good idea to actually connect these in first before you put the PSU into your case. Let's start with our 24-pin, and then let's go with our SATA cable, and finally our CPU cables. So now let's slot that into our case. So you'll want the fan side down so that the fan comes and filters through the air filter. Okay, so now that we've got our PSU installed, now it's just a matter of routing all these cables at the back to go to their respective places. So I'm gonna start with this 24-pin. Now that's going to go here, so I'm just going to go around the back for that. Okay, so we've got our motherboard power in. Now let's do our CPU power. Now the CPU power is located all the way up here. So we're going to need to route this again out the back. Okay, CPU power in. Next, we have our SATA cable for the CPU cooler. So that SATA cable is currently out the back, so I'll need to get that connected. Okay, and finally, the last bit of power that we need to connect is for the graphics cards. I think it's a good idea to keep the graphics card till last because it's such a big thing and can kind of get in the way. So it's easy to just set everything out first and then pop the graphics card in. So first, we'll just need to make room for our graphics cards. So we just need to make sure we take out the right slots here, PCI slots. So I'll just measure it up. So it looks like our second and third. And we can just pull these out. Nice and easy. All right, so graphics card is in. Pop these screws back to fix it into place. And for the final touch, we'll just need to power our graphics card. So we'll just plug that in here. And there we go. That's pretty much everything. So now I should be able to turn it on and everything should work. So here's the end result of our PC build, and I'm pretty happy with the end result. So from this point, you'll need to create a Windows boot drive to then install Windows, and then you're good to go. I'm not going to show you how to do the Windows boot drive here. There's plenty of great videos on YouTube showing you how, and I'll leave a link to a couple of them in the description below. As you can see, the Corsair has some RGB to it. The motherboard also has some RGB to it as well. So if you're into that sort of thing, that's a bonus. But for this particular case, I'm going to be covering all that up anyway, so it doesn't really matter a whole lot. I hope this helped you with your PC build. If you want to check out any of the components that I used, I'll leave a link to them in the description below. As always, it'd mean a lot if you could hit that like button and hit subscribe. And I'll see you guys next time on DT Unboxed. Cheers.